I appreciate the opportunity to speak about this program, and um, um, I'd like to believe that we started this on purpose, and we planned it out, and everything went just right, and nothing could be further from the truth. What we did in the management division of the Price Business School is that Dr. Mark Schaffman, about 2011, he became the director of our program. And one of the things that he did is that he wanted to reach out into the community and pull together a management board, which incorporated all kinds of people who had been successful in business and who were managers, whether they be directors, HR, business owners. And so we pulled together this group, and then we started to think about how we could interact our group with students. And again, the board itself actually suggested, well, let's maybe think of some type of a mentorship program. I have enough classes that at one time I had almost 500 to 600 students. Actually, I almost had 900 at one time. And so I said, well, I've got the students, and if you guys can help me develop the mentors, a list of mentors, and let's just put those two things together and see what happens. And again, I like to think that it was more scientific than that, and we had a lot of evidence, but we had nothing. And so we just kind of started it and to see what would happen. Now, a few things that what we've done is that we started out doing what we thought was right and became very flexible. And one of the things that we were really listening to is how students would respond. And so we started to make changes in our program depending on how they would respond. And I know most people understand the idea of how slow things move at a university, but in our case, because we were running our own program, we had the huge amounts of flexibility, and we could change things as necessary. Not to mention the fact we also realized that there's certain interactions that would be successful and certain interactions that we had to kind of guard the students against. And so we had to be very, very careful in terms of how we went forward with this program. But the board of directors, or I should say the board that we put together on the management division, was I would argue that it was an imperative because it made that connection between our academic community and our practitioner community. But what we found out was a few things, and I just want to list those off. Actually, I listed them off a few days ago. One of the things that we found intriguing is that mentoring on the side of the mentors is extraordinarily addictive. And it was almost like I was handing everybody big glasses of caffeine. Because what would happen is this: if they got started on this thing, they actually were looking for more. And we actually were able to find people whose schedules permitted, and other people who were just grasping at more interactions. And so that was kind of an interesting experience. Our mentorship program is designed around the 9-month school year. We actually started out trying to do it every semester and change it out, and we realized that that was not working, and it didn't give students and mentors enough time to interact enough. And so we changed it to the 9-month, and that's the way we've got it today. And so we actually have gone dual semester. We start off in the fall, and we send out an opportunity for students to get involved. They sign up. And I'll talk more about that criteria in just a few minutes. But the first meeting that we actually have is a meeting that we actually have at a local business. And then what happens is they have a lunch there. They'll oftentimes meet mentors for the first time there. And they'll also have a tour of the business. In this case, it's actually, if you know the company Emmy here in town, it's an extraordinary business. They have an extraordinary story, and they're extremely successful in being one of the #1 private COVID testing companies here in the state of Oklahoma. And so it's they've been more than magnanimous to help us out in that regard. And so we start the meeting, and what I'm trying to suggest is one of the things that became very successful is we realized that a one-on-one is extremely helpful to them as individuals, but these interim group meetings actually became more helpful in terms of making them feel more comfortable in terms of that mentor interactions. And so that combination seemed to work really well. We would also have another meeting in January, February, and we had that at another business. The business that would open up to us was Top of the World here in Norman, and we would complement that with lunch and a tour of their business, which is extensive. Nike's biggest competitor in the collegiate sportswear is actually Top of the World, located here in Norman, and so it's an extraordinary business, and they've been extremely kind to us. The last thing that we would do in terms of our group meetings is that in the spring we would get together, and Dr. Mark Schaffman would actually bring all the mentors and the mentees together, and he'd go ahead and put together a lunch over at the University Club. Now, to be honest with you, the division doesn't have an extraordinary amount of resources, and by the time we're done, we actually began to spend less resources as this program went on, and as more community involvement actually occurred. And so that's kind of the evolution of how we kind of created this thing. A few issues that we found kind of intriguing is that we noticed that the number of students that we were working with, we had to manage and try to figure out how many we could actually manage. And I know theoretically and ideologically we want to suggest that every student deserves a mentor, and I understand that principle and I understand that sensitivity, and we kind of started out that way, but we realized early on that we sided with more quality relationships as opposed to the number, and so you really have to kind of look inside. We're down to, I don't want to say down, at our highest number we had 28 students going on during a dual semester, but we're down to about a dozen to maybe 13, 14, and we found out based on our ability to interact and keep things going and the number of mentors that we had active, that was probably about the best that we could offer at any one point in time. And so that's something that we really need to think about. The other thing too, in terms of the mentor relationships, is that you have to monitor them continually, making sure, number one, that they occur, but also that they're quality interactions. And if something goes awry, you need to kind of know about it so that you can interact. And again, if you're moving more than 20 interactions, you can see how complicated that might get. And you don't want to lose anything through the cracks, because we found both that when we do lose a relationship, it's a negative relationship both for the student and, more importantly, the mentor. And so we potentially can lose that mentor at the same time. And so that's something that we always kind of monitored very closely and really kind of gauged our ability to monitor those things. Another thing that we found out that was kind of intriguing is that oftentimes people are very busy, and the mentors could interact, and we found more mentors willing to interact like every other year. And so you kind of give it a rest and then can bring them back, add new mentors, kind of give it a try. And so we found that giving mentors a rest oftentimes was a helpful technique in getting them motivated again to take on another student. We also had certain criteria that would talk to students about, number one, where they can meet, how they can meet, and also that this was never considered to be a job interview. And that was kind of an interesting interaction. Their mentors were not to hire them or to do the job interview process, which was kind of interesting, because as we got that idea started and everybody kind of nodded their head, what happened behind the scenes was a little different, and a few students actually picked up some wonderful careers based on that experience and that interaction, especially when the labor market got really tight. And they found a really good student, and they said, you know, I tried not to hire him, but I had to hire him. And so we've had some successes in those ways, but those aren't the successes that I actually need to encourage. The other thing that is the community involvement. While I've always kind of mentally kind of provided students, I actually have a partner who's a chief operating officer of a company here in town, who actually has taken the reins to be the external person in helping manage, if you will, the mentors. And what's been interesting about that experience is that as he goes to his day-to-day interactions, mentally, he's always thinking in terms of, I'll bet you would be a good mentor for some of our students. And so, and I don't think it's ruined any of his relationships. It's actually turned it around. But he's been able to find some people that have just been over the top. And so that relationship has been, I would argue, an imperative. And it's worked out really well. Last week, I had a friend of mine want me to talk to their son in terms of his academic career. And so we sat in my office and we had a one-on-one interactions. And what was intriguing is that he went home. I talked to his dad afterwards. He went home and told his parents all the things that I had said. And what was interesting, as parents know, when somebody else says something that you could have told them 10,000 times, and hearing it from somebody else suddenly makes it, the gospel truth. Well, we found out other things that are kind of interesting is that as the students would interact with managers, they would come back to the class and say, we've just talked about that. That's interesting that we're studying that. Or, and it's kind of like one of those moments where you go, well, if you would just read, you're perfectly fine. No, somebody else said it was important, so now we consider it important, and they're engaged in asking questions. And so that was kind of an interesting artifact that I found kind of funny. The other thing is listening to students, listening to their interaction. We maneuvered our interactions based on how they responded. My first couple groups, I was very closely, I was interacting with them pretty aggressively, and I was gleaning information, and they knew it, and it wasn't like I was trying to hide anything, and they would give me critical assessments of how they felt, the interactions, and so we started to guard those relationships and be a little bit more strict in terms of the criteria. One of the problems that we found problematic is obviously the young lady versus older man out in the community having a cup of coffee, and I understand that 99.9% of the time that's not a problem. But in some instances, it could be perceived as a problem. And so we have to guard that interaction. And that may not be a circumstance that you guys are dealing with, but it's certainly something we had to work with. We, in terms of the criterion selection, we noticed that people like to sign up for stuff and don't necessarily always like to follow up with stuff. And that happens quite often. And so what we did is we actually made the sign-up process a little bit more difficult. They had to write something about themselves and kind of a what do I want to be when I grow up type of thing. Now, part of that helped our matching scenario, but the other part elevated the commitment. So if they were willing to go ahead and spend the time on this, they would. We have found out that they are just as willing, if not more willing, to go ahead and spend the time with their mentors. And so it created a more quality relationship in terms of the expected interaction. I talked about the group meetings, and that actually kind of evolved in our effort to try to kind of tap into the groups. It's easier to get them all together. But we found out that that was kind of an interesting interaction because it allowed the students not to be alone in terms of their interaction, and they could talk to each other about different things that were going on with their mentor, and it allowed them to then bring that concept to their mentorship relationship. And so we found that was really kind of a solid interaction, or something that we've learned along the process. The challenges that we are always facing, because you have two groups that you're messing with, it's kind of like eBay. You've got one side the seller and the other side the buyer, and so we're constantly interacting, trying to find good mentors, and we found a good group, and we feel very comfortable with that. But you always want to augment that to a large degree, because you want to be able to give students the best that you've got available. We also look at different businesses throughout the Norman community, because they're also offering that interaction, and it's been a very positive experience, and it's a very soft sell, I have to tell you, and most people are nodding their head by the time, even before we're done talking. The other thing that's kind of intriguing is in the business community, it's not just the CEOs or the officers of the organization. Oftentimes the underlings want to get involved also in the process, and so we'll have sometimes we'll have 5 or 6 from just one company take the interaction and take the responsibility to be a part of that program for that 9-month interaction. The other thing, of course, is always trying to find those committed students. And again, we know that if the students aren't committed to the interaction, that it kind of turns the mentor off. And so we're always trying to pull these two groups together, making sure that or I should say, trying to increase the probability that we'll have a positive experience. But what's been intriguing about that, this whole process, is we've found some things that really work. We kind of divorced ourselves from things that really weren't working, and we found out that we actually could invest even less resources as we went along, and it's been kind of an intriguing experience. As I said before, the experience is very addicting to mentors. They enjoy it. In fact, I'm going to go to a board meeting after this meeting and talk about this, and what I'm going to have to do is pull back the reins, because the board will more likely than not want to continue the process, but the interaction is a very personal interaction. It's a very face-to-face interaction, and we know, and research has shown that face-to-face teaching, face-to-face interaction is the best. And the whole idea of mentoring online really doesn't glean the best outcome, and we know that. And so the online scenario will put a Band-Aid on it, and we're hoping for better days when we can get back to that face-to-face interaction, that personal relationship. I'll go ahead and close with one little story that was kind of fun. There was the CEO of Top of the World. I know I've talked about that company before. He pulled in a mentee, and they got together, and what was interesting about this is that Scott, who's the CEO of Top of the World, I'll step back. He just sold his company, and so the Top of the World doesn't exist anymore as of just a couple weeks ago. But what was funny about this relationship is his wife enjoyed the interaction so much that he actually was invited to their home for Christmas, and they practically adopted the guy, the student. And I know that they still interact, and she calls him, making sure that he's okay, and in terms of his career. And many of these relationships have continued on and on and on. But what was funny is that they were laughing and talking about what Scott does in terms of designing hats. And he said, you know what, you ought to let me design one. And sure enough, those two didn't get together, and they designed an entire line of hats. And so he had the experience of being able to go through that process with virtually no risk. And it was really kind of a fun process. Another thing that a last story is there was a young lady, and what was interesting about this is oftentimes what we expect to happen doesn't really happen. And what I mean by that is I had a very boisterous, very progressive student, and she had her thoughts about things. And what was interesting is because of the matches, she matched up with this guy who's a chief operating officer of a company who was extremely conservative. And we thought to ourselves, oh, just matching these two together and we're in big trouble. This is going to explode. And then, of course, the mischievousness in myself said, let's do it anyway and see, watch the fireworks, because this would be a lot of fun. But I just talked to the gentleman not just a few weeks ago, and he said, you know what, we've had such a great time. And I think the pairing was about 4 years ago. They still interact and are still great friends. He follows her career, and they've never stopped interacting. And so it's been intriguing. I wish I had predictive capability of seeing what relationships would work and which don't. I have divorced myself from the notion that people that are like one another tend to make the best pairing. That hasn't followed through. And I've done my best, but I'm always surprised what people get along and stay together in terms of their relationships. It's been kind of intriguing. But anyway, that's our program. And we've had a lot of fun doing it. It's pulled our community more into our university family. And I have to say, the students by far have benefited, and the mentors have benefited. They really enjoy the process, and we've had a lot of fun doing it. With that, it looks like I'm way over my speaking time. Let me respond to any questions that you might have. And again, I told you I would do this. I just kind of yammer on. Beverly, I warned you about that. But let me respond to any questions you might have.
Okay, Leah?
Yes, we do have one question in the chat, and the question is, are background checks done on mentors?
No, but that's not to suggest we wouldn't do that if we had a mechanism for it. Now, we have an informal process where my community counterpart actually does kind of make some phone calls and kind of does that process, but we don't have anything formalized. If in fact the relationship was with a minor, if we had that type of thing going on, then we would certainly do that. That would be no question. I know that some of you are dealing with mentorship relationships with young people, and in my mind, I don't see how you could avoid that and ignore that. Not to mention the fact that liability that would be created if you didn't have a formalized process. In our scenario, however, you know, these are adults interacting with adults, and I understand the power differential, and that's something we're always concerned about. But our process is extremely informal, asking people, talking to people, and we'd like to think we're careful, but it's not a formalized system. And that may be something that we might change in the future. We haven't had a problem, but that's probably not a good excuse of why not to do something.
Alrighty, thank you. The next question is, how does the program go about pairing students with mentors? So an example would be, what characteristics or experiences are taken into consideration when you're matching?
The write-up that they have to do to be a part of our mentorship program gives us a lot of information in terms of the type of things that they've done and the type of things that they want to do. And I stopped short there because some of our mentors can talk about all kinds of industries, and so I don't know that it's exactly predictive. But we have tried to kind of, in a soft way, to kind of match interest and match industry interests. And we've even gone as far as to listen to what the student is saying in terms of their application, and actually go down and try to find somebody in that industry. We've actually done that process, and we've actually made those matches, and some of those have been very, very successful. But we receive all the applications, we read through the application, we sit them out on a large table. We look at the list of mentors that we have, we know the industries that they're in, and we do try to make some connective efforts in terms of the industries. The other thing that we really look at is what they want to be when they grow up, kind of thought process. What type of connections should they be making in that particular industry? And that's probably a more important approach, and so that we can kind of push them in an interesting direction. Some of the things that are kind of interesting is that a lot of the mentors that have been successful in their particular industries have a huge, this will age myself, a huge Rolodex in terms of contacts. And they'll literally, and I hate when they do this, but they'll pull out a card and they'll say, you need to contact this person. And that has created real opportunities for students to kind of make connections, and more importantly, get used to making those connections. And it's been an interesting process. But I think the important thing to remember is that although we do kind of a soft match, I would argue that that has probably not been our greatest success story, if you will. Because oftentimes what we expect doesn't happen. And people who are from vastly different industries are able to interact in a way that is just has been phenomenal. And so it's a very soft interaction. I think, to be honest with you, the mentor themselves can kind of overcome a lot of differences in terms of what the student wants to be. And what's intriguing is that it also gives the student an opportunity to consider maybe career paths that they've never even thought about before. And that's probably something that many of these students need to start thinking, because it's one thing to try to become something, it's another thing not to know what you want to become, because there's so many choices out there. And oftentimes these mentors help them kind of narrow their choices, and then produce contacts and allow them to kind of, if you will, blossom in their own network. And so I would suggest that it has not been a part of our success. Finding good mentors has probably been the most important part of the success, because oftentimes these mentors are very flexible in terms of what they can do, and bring some realism to the student's life.
All right, thank you so much. The next question is, do you have training for mentors and or mentees?
We do have kind of a set of rules that we actually set down, and we send those to the mentors, and they acknowledge their acceptance of those ideas. To the mentees, on the application itself, it has a kind of a list of rules and expectations. The employment one was one that I had talked about previously, that they had no expectations of being employed or hired or anything like that from the mentor. But other than that, we don't have any type of criteria where they're signing on the dotted line, or we have set rules that we just hope and acknowledge that they adhere to. And again, my concern is more importantly, if the students were much younger, more importantly minors, that would be an imperative. That would be the first thing that I would go after. Not only the background check, but the set of rules and standards, and making sure that we hold people accountable to those type of things. We don't want to mess with younger people. In our case, we're typically, the students are juniors or above, and so they're not, they're a little bit more, I should say this way, they're a lot more mature, and they're doing well, and they've got some ideas of where they want to go, and so they're not just hollowed out cylinders. They've actually got something that they want to work with and some things that they want to do. And so while they're driven to be a part of this program, they're also driven in terms of some of the areas that they want to work. Some of them have already done internships with different businesses, and so it's the nature of the student that I think oftentimes makes the program a little bit different. But if we were working with younger students, even in college, I think I would be much more aggressive in terms of those criteria, the rules, the formalization of those rules. Anything less than 18, I think I would be extremely aggressive, but that's just me. And we've not had to face that type of criteria.
All right, so the next question is, can you share your application, or can you tell us which website it's on so I can type it in the chat for them?
What website for what?
Like an application to, I believe, become a mentor.
Oh, an application to become a mentor? We actually don't have an application, but if you wanted to send my my email that I never answer to, I'll go ahead and make sure that people have access to that if they're interested. No, I jest. But if I think the best entrance would be my email, and the application process and all the formalized documents are all behind the scenes. We actually don't set it out for anybody. And we also, since the program is designed just for management students, we actually only send them applications. And so it's not for everybody. And so we start already making those cuts in terms of the students and the area of focus that they're interested in. Now and then we'll let an accounting student in, or a finance student, or an entrepreneurship student, or something along those lines. The accounting students are always tough to deal with because they're so smart, and that just ruins the whole program. And so we have to be very selective in that process. But we're looking for management students. The other part that's kind of that's fun is that since I deal with so many students, I'll often talk to students about their area of focus, and even make some informal invitations, and then send them the application itself. And so it's not as accessible externally as you might suggest, and this has actually been actually an advantage for us, because we've been able to be relatively selective in terms of the people that get involved. And I think that might be an advantage. And so making it known to everybody, I don't know if that's in your best interest.
Okay, so I got some clarification about the question, and it's actually, sure. If a mentee is wanting to have a mentor, what is the application for that? Is there an application?
Yes, and we send that application every year out to our management students, and so we select those out and we send them right to those management students, and we'll have at any one point in time, we'll have sometimes a couple thousand students that will receive this application process. And again, it takes time to put together the application, and so that criteria helps us to understand their seriousness. And we've actually turned some students down, and so it's a selection process, and so we keep fighting this too. This whole notion of wanting every student to have the opportunity to have a mentor. And also it's easier to manage a smaller program, and that's we're trying to play that game. I think we've sided to managing a smaller program and then work from there. Has been an easier process. Trying to get as many as we can has been something that it just hasn't turned out as well.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, what percentage of your student participants are students of color? What feedback have they given you regarding their experience?
We actually have students of color, could be I actually don't think in those terms, but if I was to think about it, I'd probably say students of color could incorporate anywhere from 25% to 30% of our students on an annual basis. One of the things that does happen is that I interact with our Office of Inclusion, and I'll actually go after students and talk about the program and give them the opportunity to have that program. It has been extremely successful in that area, and it's been a lot of fun. One of the things that's been interesting is too the mentors giving opportunities that might not have otherwise been given. They feel like they're making a difference, and I've heard it mentioned several times that that's an extraordinary opportunity. But I would say anywhere from 20 to 30% on an annual basis. We actually have our own Office of Inclusion on the first floor of the business school, and one of the reasons we have that is to encourage African American and Latino students to come into the business school, which traditionally has not been something that those particular students have kind of gravitated towards. And so we're starting to turn that around, or I should say make an effort in that area. The ironic thing about the whole process is that companies are asking us constantly for minority students, and they're actually paying 5 to 10% more for these particular students because they want to create a greater breadth of employees. And so it's a real opportunity for young students of color to really make some inroads and find some wonderful opportunities out there. And to be honest with you, everybody looks positively in this area. I guess that's probably as much as I can say about that.
Okay, and the last question we have so far is, do you tend to have a surplus of mentors and lack of students to participate? Is it the opposite, or is it not a problem for your program?
I'm going to answer that, but I'm going to go back. I was just reading what feedback have they given you regarding their experience in terms of students of minority background. Actually, you have to understand that they've already had a couple years interacting with business school, and so they've been acclimated. And so regardless of where these students come from, there's a lot of acclimation process that has already occurred. And so it's not like the mentors have to be aggressive in terms of trying to help people understand things, or at least acclimate to the business community. And I just kind of wanted to respond to that. Surplus of mentors, lack of students, and again, it's the eBay game, trying to figure out where you have people wanting to sell something and people wanting to buy something. It's a constant game. Some years I'll have an enormous amount of students and just a couple mentors, and the other way it'll be other years it'll be the other way. I think the hardest thing to do is to manage the mentors and keep them engaged. That's the hardest process. The OU name does carry some weight, and people do want to be associated to the OU system. It's actually kind of an interesting resumeable item that they'll actually add to their resumes, if you will. And so that has been helpful to us, and we're a beneficiary of that interaction. But I don't know that I could. I think I'm always worried about the number of mentors. I think that's the one that's really kind of. And I've always got about 3 or 4 mentors that have been around that I can trust, that really enjoy the process. There's one particular gentleman who owns, and this is kind of intriguing. He owns a couple Chick-fil-A's. And the reason why that's intriguing is because they don't allow people to own more than one Chick-fil-A. And so he owns a couple of them. Not only does he interact with his employees on a face-to-face basis, he actually has been able to help us. And he kind of allows me some variation in terms of, like, for example, if I've got an extra student, he'll take on that extra student. If I don't need him that year, he has no problem with it. And so allowing that flexibility, you get a few mentors that allow that flexibility, and it kind of takes up some of that slack. But I would argue that the mentors are the hardest thing to manage. And without that reach that we've had in terms of the community, and my friend who's constantly thinking in terms of that would be a good mentor, I don't think I could probably pull it off. I mean, we've had mentors that live in Houston and they fly up to Oklahoma City on a weekly basis, and they live all the way in Houston, but they're constantly coming up here, and they'll just have a quick chat once a month with a mentee, and we've done that before, and that really worked out well. And we're always sad when a good mentor like changes jobs. I mean, we're over there hoping that they don't get promoted, or nothing disrupts our operation, or that heaven forbid they get more compensation. That just ruins our whole program. And so, but what's intriguing again is how long lasting these relationships have been going on, and the ones that I've been able to keep up with are still in play. In some of them almost 8 years later, and so it's been kind of intriguing. But that would be the area that I would focus on the most aggressively, is the mentors themselves. I want to be able to respond to Brian's effort. Two kind of interesting things kind of materialized, and I say this not only as informative but also an offer, is that I was talking to our inclusion director, and we actually put 2 presentations together that has received an enormous amount of praise. And one of the presentation was merely how to ask and negotiate more pay, and the other one is how to invest and create a portfolio. And I have to tell you, I did the presentation for a sorority here at OU, and I offered it, and over 70 young ladies, African American young ladies, got in the room, and I looked around and I said to myself, what do I have that I can interact with these young ladies? And we just, how can I interact, and how can I communicate? And this wonderful young lady got up and said, you know what? As African American women, we are tired of being at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, and that guy's going to help us get out. And I thought, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm all over it, and I've had a lot of fun doing that. And in fact, I've more than had fun. It's actually been a passion of mine, and